Hello everyone and welcome to the Digital Dissect Podcast. On this podcast we talk about all things digital, from design and delivery to culture and business goals. My name is Dave and I will be your host on our journey through the digital world, and I will be interviewing and speaking to experts throughout the industry about their knowledge, experience and what they see happening in the near future when it comes to digital trends. I'll be asking lots of questions, so I'll hopefully be your guide as we pick the brains of industry experts from all around the digital world. Today we have James from PixelTree, who has taken some time out to talk about their design processes and collaborating with other businesses. Hi James.
Hi Dave, you okay mate?
I'm great mate, I'm great. Good to see you again.
And you?
Why don't you just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and about PixelTree, the company?
Yeah, okay, so a little bit about me. So as you rightly said, I'm James. Company is PixelTree, and PixelTree has been going as a company for, coming up 10 years. So we're just about to approach our 10th year in business. From a personal perspective, I've been into sort of technology, web design, right from being probably 11, 12, I used to work on a tool called Macromedia Dreamweaver, which had fireworks and Flash back then. So I've been into it from a very young age and was designing kind of websites way back in Dreamweaver for some quite big companies, actually. Not to a great coding standard, but actually from a design perspective, they were pretty good at the time. And it's something that then I progressed through to university, actually dropped out of university, and in my third year and set up PixelTree instead as a kind of way of moving into the kind of industry, if you like. At the time, there was very limited opportunity within design agencies. I was doing a lot of freelance work for agencies in and around Northwest and beyond, and then just saw an opportunity to set up on my own. Had a little big bank of clients that we could work with, and yeah, I've grown it from there really. So that's a little bit about myself. From a PixelTree perspective, we're an experienced design agency, so we've gone, I guess, full tilt really, in the sense that we started very much in the early days as graphic design, and that was because I'd come from a graphic design type background and then moved very quickly into web. So again, going back to kind of the origins of what I was talking about before, very much an easy transition from graphic to what was then basic web design, if you like, through to what we are now, which is probably more in the, well, it's definitely more in the product design environment as opposed to just web design. So although we do cover the design of e-commerce platforms and websites, a lot of the work we do now is more on digital products. So that could be apps, dashboards, portals, that sorts of types of platform, and I'm really focusing on particularly the design and user experience element of it, as opposed to the elements that you guys do, which is more of the development and build side of things.
Yeah, obviously, and that's why we know each other, isn't it? Quite well.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
I didn't know that you had like a little go at development back in your youth. I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah. I guess that's where I started. I mean, for me, when I was probably 10 or 11, so it was definitely the early years of secondary school. I didn't understand the difference. It felt like all one and the same then. You know, especially with a tool like Dreamweaver, you were able to almost design as you were coding. The code was written for you as you were designing, then it was kind of for you to delve into the kind of code and make things happen and fix things. So it felt like one and the same, and it was only really when which I guess is how a lot of people started as well. It was, you know, very much kind of coders would design and designers would code, and there would be a lot of overlap. And then as obviously you start to enter industry and you start to see the real world, and that there is actually two branches here. That there's developers who are very much skill set are in writing back end or front end code, and then there's the developers and there's designers there that, you know, are basically there to map out research and understand user pain points and try and map out a user experience as a whole, and then present that in terms of visuals and prototypes. Then that was for me where my natural instincts lay and still lie. But yeah, very much had 2 or 3 years of doing it really, and actually built I don't know if I can mention customers here, but back then my dad worked for a company called the Manchester Building Society. I did work experience for them when I was 12, I think, or 13, and then went on to design and develop one of their mortgage application submission platforms that allowed brokers to submit decisions in principle essentially to the Building Society, which would then be approved and a decision in principle would be made. So that was one of the big jobs that I worked on when I was younger.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah, and something I didn't know about you. I thought, yeah, you stuck to that design, and you're right, it is a very different skill set, isn't it? But yeah, okay,
Yeah.
I've brought you on to talk about design, so why don't we just smash into that? You've already talked about what your background and how you steered yourself into that. I'm gonna kind of go off the wheel and start with the negatives. What
Okay.
are the problems you see with most designs that don't succeed? Obviously, when people come to you if they've had a problem, or even just products that you see in the wild that don't do their job. What are the main problems?
Yeah, I mean, particularly in the UK, I think around sort of Central and Eastern Europe, this is actually a lot better. But I think as a whole, the UK, no one was going to like to hear this, but we do lag behind a little bit in the way that we approach design. I think if you look at people intrinsically or companies intrinsically, less so agencies, but definitely companies that have internal design, and they probably focus too much on the user interface than they do the user experience. So that's predominantly where problems are. You might have these beautiful looking websites or apps or platforms, dashboards, portals, whatever the product is, but no one's actually really thought about the user experience. No one's actually spent time in the research phase. No one's kind of conducted any usability testing. No one's conducted any really kind of like focus groups with customers. So anything that interacts with customers at any time really should be tested with them, I think, and actually spoken to them first to gather some insight. I think we potentially do that pretty poorly in the UK and across the wider sphere of the world as well. There are certain countries where I think this is done a lot better. If you look at other industries, for example, like engineering, that just would be unheard of to think about Elon Musk putting a car design together and not prototyping it, not test driving it, or not testing the stuff in wind tunnels and that sort of thing. It would just be unthinkable. But with digital products, it seems like that's the forgotten. And so actually, I think that's predominantly where a lot of the problems lies, that when we have clients come to us and say this thing just isn't working, whatever it is, it's probably because there's either underlying issues that they kind of think are there, but they've got no way or nowhere to validate that. Or alternatively, they just simply don't know. They've got no idea as to why it's not working. Usually the product strategy is sound. They've got a good idea, they've got a good product. It's just that they've now spent this money and this time on it, and unfortunately, it's not harnessing or not yielding the results that they expected, which to people in kind of non-design backgrounds in particular is probably quite disturbing. They just expect for these things to happen. But then when you outline to them, okay, well, what was the research done? What sort of research methods did you use? When was the testing done in the design phase? None of that's been encountered the vast majority of the time. That's where I think the eyes wide open, quite widely, and they're like, we could have probably solved a lot of this if we just spent a little bit longer in that design phase.
Yeah, well, I think obviously you spoke quite passionately about that, but obviously in the digital sector, we just trust ourselves to get it right first time, and then wonder why that doesn't always work. Clearly.
Yeah, I mean it's tough, isn't it? Because as a team of designers or developers, there is an element of, well, we'll have seen projects like this before, and so there's always an element of kind of collectively being able to harness the best practice or industry experience or product experience, sector experience, whatever you call it, and say, well, we've done this for X clients, so we know that Y will work. And that's a good, that's what an agency is usually made up of as well, is that people can go to and buy the experience of that team, that collective team, and say, right, we're going to pay you X amount for this project, but we're buying into a whole team of people who are industry experts. They know how to build this thing. And there is an element of being able to kind of harness that best practice. But unfortunately, there aren't really too many products that are ever like for like exactly the same. There'll always be differences. There'll always be a different target audience, slightly different demographic. There'll be a slightly different case use for each of the products. And so even if you don't do the research side, which I would highly, highly advise, I think if you were to kind of jump into some sort of usability testing once the product's been designed and ask them to kind of complete missions on the app or the product, the website, or whatever, with an example target demographic, I think a lot of people would find some of the flaws out much earlier on than they've spent then months going into the build and getting it all production ready, launching, and then finding out there's some kind of basic and fundamental issues here that we didn't foresee, which could render the project a complete failure, or it could be better optimized from the get-go.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I'm going to ask another question, but I think you've touched on a few of them here, and it's kind of almost the adverse to the other. So what are the main features you focus on to make a good design process then versus these ones that fail?
Yeah, I think it's like you say, it's completely the inverse of what we've just discussed. It's spending time. If I was to summarize it, it would be spending time with more people. That would be it in a kind of simplistic form. And I know that that does sound very luxury to a lot of people, but if you were market research teams are specifically designed for this, they'll go and speak to people to find out what problems they're having in their lives or what problems they've got with existing products, and then where the market gap lies. We can do a similar thing in the design process by conducting user research, and there's various different forms of that, and I know we've not probably got the time to go into all of those today, but there's a plethora of different methods that you can draw upon to get the right information that you need, dependent upon what it is you're looking for, and then from there it's very much going into, I think, workshop type formats. There's various different workshops that you can run, but essentially it should be following, at least in my opinion, the kind of design thinking formula. So, essentially understanding what those, from the research you've conducted, what are the pain points of the customer, what are the things that you're trying to overcome in design, and also what are the business goals, because they're not kind of separate from all of this. Yes, there might be this problem that a customer's got, but also, or a potential customer's got, but also what does the business want to carry out, what does it need to carry out, what the functions of this product intrinsically need to do. And then from there, it's very much moving into kind of the workshop of trying to collaborative as a team, pulling in multidisciplines. So, not just spending time with marketing as good as they are at knowing the product or what the product needs to offer. It's looking at bringing people in from a customer, a customer relations perspective. So someone who's on the ground dealing with customers. It might be finance, might be marketing, might be sales, might be managerial structure teams, all of which are involved in that workshop, so that we're looking at it from a 360-degree perspective and looking, okay, what are the biggest challenges? How do we overcome these challenges collaboratively and collectively? What are the solutions that people internally within the company come up with? Does that work? Does that not work? And then essentially going through to prototyping that solution, testing it from a very early perspective or at a very early stage, by usability testing, and then iterating thereafter. So making sure that you take the feedback you've had from people and kind of reviewing that in the cold light of day without any bias as to, well, we know they've said that, but at the end of the day, we think this. That's your target demographic there. That's who you're going to be selling this product to. If that's what they're saying, they ain't wrong. And finding solutions to overcome that before then moving into kind of the full UI design process and going through to development.
Yeah. It must be difficult sometimes for you, James, to get all of those different players in the room from certain businesses. I know it'd be hard just getting internally that number from ours.
Yeah, it is. And I think I was at we went down to an expo in London, and I did a talk there about basically the way to rapidly innovate products. And someone asked that exact question. They'd said, we run this, we run these internally for a company. They were a big FTSE 100 company, and said, we have this team internally that runs these. We can't get the buy-in from people to actually to partake in these workshops because they see the time as too valuable. What would you do? And I said, just don't run them. And they said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, there's no point going through that process and getting 75% of people's time, because you're basically wasting the people who do turn up's time, because there's 3 or 4 people who can't be bothered to make it into the room. But those 3 or 4 people typically who value their time above what you're doing will be the first ones at the latter stage of the process to say, well, that's wrong, and I don't think that's right, and that should be. So it's basically wasted time. So you may as well just say, well, actually, when can you do? And we'll do it for then instead. And this is super, super important, because at the end of this is going to be this new product or this new service or this new app or an optimized app or an optimized service, whatever it is that they're looking to create. And they're going to be targeted on it in one way, shape, or form. If it's the owner of the company, then they're going to have a vested interest in it being a success. So if they can't give up like 1 to 2 days, then is the product worth moving forward with in the first place? And that is difficult to communicate. I'm not saying you communicate it quite as bluntly as that, but ultimately, if something's not worth 2 days of someone's time, that's going to be a massive factor in the growth of this business in one way, shape, or form, then potentially it's not worth running with in the first place. It mustn't mean that much to the company for the kind of main people that might be involved to give up a day or 2 of time.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And It's just the tricky bit, isn't it? It's trying to navigate all those calendars, which with people that are busy, but you're right, they're not going to buy in and get involved. And they're probably the most necessary sometimes as well.
And I'm not saying that, for every project you follow that process. In an ideal world, you would, but particularly when there's a big, what I would call sort of high stakes project. So something that's going to, really revolutionize the company or take them way above the competitors, or it's a new company that are going to launch a new application. Let's say they're a startup and they're going to, if the app isn't right, they're nothing. That's all they've got. Yeah. So if they can't pull themselves into that 2-day workshop, for example, or whatever the workshop's going to be, and give up that time, then, arguably you could say, well, what's the point? This is the thing that you're all going to focus on, so it needs to be right. And we're giving up our time. Obviously, they're paying us for that time, but we're all making sure that us as a team are going to be there. So we'd like you there because we want the very best output for you as a client.
Yeah, great. So we've spoke before, and obviously we're quite close as businesses. Your kind of approach to stuff was kind of inspired by a book, right?
That's right, yeah. So a lot of what I've talked about, I guess for us, the real eye-opener was, or for me personally, a friend recommended a book. It was a book called Sprint by a guy called James Knapp. And I read it the first time and I was like, I was so busy. I was like, this is great. I mean, this is sort of exactly what we need, except it just won't work in the real world. And so dismissed it. And then I spoke to him again a couple of months later, just after Christmas it was, and he came back and said, did you read that book? What did you think? I was like, yeah. He said, read it again. So I read it again. I was like, okay, I could kind of see how this works. And then I read it a third time when I was away on holiday. And I started with a little bit of less time pressures and business commitments. I had time to think about how we could potentially structure a design sprint process into our business to kick projects off initially, and then it's kind of evolved over time. But essentially, we've kind of built a process that we call our product sprint around the initial design sprint process, which is a 5-day process defined in the book Sprint.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting when you talk to business leaders, especially in the tech space, how many books inspire like their thinking around not even just like what they're doing, but how they're running their businesses. So I always love to hear like people have taken in your case, a book that was about what you were doing and thought, God, yeah, these have got some really valid points in here. I'm gonna jump on them.
There's so many. There's from businesses I know that have read books that help them pitch different ways, through to how they've got a marketing funnel that they then, like Hacking Growth, for example, is a great book for kind of learning how to just go about really measuring and optimizing marketing funnels or marketing strategies. There's so many good books out there for tech companies that you can read. And then I know so many businesses that have almost built their entire business model around a book or adapted it. And we've definitely done that. We've changed the way that we work and operate pretty much entirely based on thinking, well, these were the intrinsic problems we had as a business when kicking projects off. The lack of alignment from stakeholders, getting to the end of a project or nearing the end of a design phase, and then people coming in last minute and saying, well, what about that and that? That was always a massive problem for us, which has just virtually disappeared because of this process. There's certain things that you just see a solution for and go, okay, well, it's not perfect, but it's kind of there and we could implement that. So I think that's what we did. Yeah,
that's interesting. Do you find that you have any like kickback or difficulty with people when you lay out what is your quite robust plan and process and say, this is what we believe we need to do? Does anyone's like, God, we don't need that, and strip that out because they've got preconceptions? Or do most people get on board when they approach you and think, yeah, God, these guys know what they're talking about?
Yeah, I think it depends on sort of size of company, project, personnel. It's obviously always very different. There's an ever-growing number of people who've heard about the process now. Not that they ever really approach us because of that. It's not, we do get inbound inquiries because we rank quite well for the term, but that's usually a select group of people who know about the process, who want that process run for them or facilitated, and so they'll contact us. But a lot of the time, the problems are always the same. What we kind of don't say is, well, follow this tried and tested design sprint process. It's very much for us. We've built out our own product sprint, which is a big adaptation of that process, really, and essentially solves a lot of the problems that they come to us. So if there's an inbound client call, usually the problems are always different, the challenges are always different, but essentially the same kind of key things come up time and time again. And this is where you can sort of say, well, the antidote to that is this, the antidote to that is that. And it's trying to fit their, or make them understand that the process you follow fits their needs and desires, really. So there is some pushback, definitely, where people will say, I mean, and that on a lot of the cases, that's because they might have already done parts of it. So they might approach us and say, well, we don't need that part because we've already done our own user research. Well, if you've done your own user research, fantastic. You know, that why pay us to do it? It's rare, but there are people who do that already. Or we don't need that because we've already got wireframes made up. And that's the difficult one is well, if you've got that already, you've kind of jumped the gun in terms of the process a little bit. And that's where there's more education needed around how have you structured those? Have they been structured from that base of just someone sketching it at the back of a paper based on this is what we think it needs to do, and we've looked at competitor sites and kind of copied little bits from there? Or is it based on we've done some user research, we know that this is the core thing we want to get people to do, and we think this is the most effective way of doing that in the shortest possible time? So sometimes there is kickback, yeah, and we're flexible. If someone really doesn't want something, we're not going to force it on them or say, well, in which case we can't work together. But we do try and push that we think this is a process that will work for you because it solves all of the outcomes that you want as a business.
Nice. So a more businessy question on a personal level: has it made running your business easier, having a kind of more defined set way of doing things? Like, I'm not saying you do the same thing every time because every project's different, but each of the steps all the way. Has that helped you run your business easier? Yeah,
hugely. Yeah. Particularly because what we've been able to do is take, like you say, every project is different. There's always, nuances and variations in a project, but the core steps for a lot of the, let's just take as an example, usability testing. So the client's already got an application. They come to us and say, we've got some problems and we think that these are the solutions. And what we'd probably recommend is that actually that a series of usability tests, be that moderated or unmoderated, are undertaken, so that we're not just saying, well, we think this and you think that, let's do that and let's see where we get to. If we can do that and there's the budget there, then that would be kind of a go-to. And so from that perspective, it's literally a series of tasks that we repeat. Okay, they're always different in terms of the outcomes and the prep, but from our perspective, it's understanding what the product is and doing, kind of spending some time with the product, then coming up with a test plan, writing a test plan report. Once that test plan's been approved by the client, it's then recruiting user participants. All of these things are step by step. So from that perspective, it's so easy to train people when they come into the business, but also it's kind of you can easily define where things are up to, and it's a repeatable process. So it does make running things much easier. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, and I think that's a really nice story. I think it's something we've struggled with sometimes, of having different ideas and different approaches to things internally. Never mind when you then add in clients and your partner's thoughts on it, like makes it much more difficult sometimes. So it's great to see that that's helping a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult, isn't it? But if I do think across the board from people I've spoke to in other agencies where there's a kind of a productized offering, and ultimately it's not a product, it's a service, but if you can productize that service in some way. So development's really difficult because how do you, every project needs to be developed differently. You could probably productize the way that you manage that in terms of you could productize development sprints, for example, so key blocks of work, and we think you're going to need X number of sprints for the work to be completed. But in design, you can kind of start to box things up. So, for example, user experience audit, depending upon the product, it's going to take X number of days or whatever. So you can kind of average that out and say, here's the different products, here's the outputs that you'll get from that. Which makes things so much easier when you come in to sell as well, because people like that, don't they? They like kind of things that are kind of boxed up and ready to go. And they say to you, okay, well, how much this? Well, it would depend on this, and would depend on. You can kind of say that's the price.
Yeah.
And people like that certainty, and they like that confidence of a company delivering something, saying that's the price, and we can tailor it, but ultimately that's what we think you need. That's what we think how much it's going to cost. So it's always, interestingly for us as well, not only has it become easier to run the business, I would say it's become easier to close sales Not that people like it to be called that, if anyone was listening, you know, but that ultimately is what businesses are trying to do, isn't it? And when you've got these kind of very bespoke projects that go on, and there's lots of costings and lots of different, it's very difficult to go to a customer and deliver that format, and then there's reviews and there's internal meetings that take, that kind of pitch to close it can be quite a lengthy time process. And so when you've got a product, it feels to us like, well, it doesn't just feel, we know it is quicker to close that, because you've offered them, here's the product, here's the solution. There's going to be a few tailor-made tweaks that we need to do. We understand that every time, but essentially, here's the pitch deck that we've got ready, prepared for it. Everything's there. The cost is there. The outputs are there. The delivery things, you know, everything's there. It's quite quick to do. Great.
Yeah, super. It's super to see that success. Another thing that you guys have been successful, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I know this because we work with you, is collaborating with other tech agencies and people like that. What do you see the main advantage of collaboration?
Well, I think the main advantage would be that you're essentially getting experts in specific areas to work on the areas that they're best at. That would be, for me, the main. There's lots of others, by the way, but that would be the main one for the customer, actually, as opposed to us as companies. The customers getting, you know, the best X or Y or Z along that process at various different stages, as opposed to, we're very good at this, we're really good at this, and we're okay at that, and we're not so good at that. So, you know, they get a kind of a 90, 100% service, and then it drops to 50, and then maybe down to 30 towards the end, or whatever wherever the skill sets lie. I think that would be the main one. And like I said, that's probably not for me or for us as a company, or for you, or for you as a company, but for the client, that's their win. I think if we were to look at internally, the way it would be is that it's just really good to work with other companies that have good people, that can share successes, that can share best practice and share knowledge.
Yeah, share's a great word, and I think it's used a lot around tech, and I like working in the tech industry because of that. I think it is quite collaborative. Yeah. I slightly disagree, James. I think, so we used to say we do loads of different things in tech, and actually specialising now into mobile applications and the focus around that has really helped us streamline loads of problems and inter-team conflicts about stuff. I actually think it does help the clients. You're absolutely right, and you need to think about that first, but I think it's helped us a lot on focusing ourselves as a group of people.
And is that because, you know, when you say that, is that because now you can kind of align behind, this is what we do, this is what we're good at, so these are the types of people we need, these are the types of projects we want? Is it because of that?
Yeah, and I think it's also nice to get everybody behind a single message. Everyone can buy in, even if they were already here and part of these, what I'd say, doing all the little bits around our core offering. Everyone, it's nice to get everyone pushing in one direction with us when you say you've got a specialty, and I think that really helps everybody understand when they come to work every day, not just as a sales piece and a marketing piece. When they come to work, this is what we do as a collective, and we do it really well.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree with that. Yeah, I think I echo everything you've just said there. I think from a recruitment perspective, it's much easier. I think when you go and talk to people, just as we're doing now, you know, potential customers, any sort of expo or networking event, you can kind of be clear and say, this, you know, this is what we do. I think there's always a risk in that you can become very, very niche and very specialised, and I've seen some adverse effects of that especially over the COVID period, where someone's, you know, this speciality within this sector for this type of business, you know, that I think has worked. I've seen companies grow massively for that, but also it does put you at risk, doesn't it? It exposes you as, if you're only in hospitality as an example right now. Obviously the company's going to have a massive knock on because hospitality's been closed for the last 2 years or 18 months, whatever it is. But I think as a whole, specialising on like you guys do now, you know, a tech sector, you know, you're very clear on what it is you're looking for. It makes it so much easier to recruit, to talk to people, to kind of get that message out there and be more targeted with that approach.
Yeah, have you ever had, I don't know, like clients or people question when you're like, oh, we want to introduce you to these guys because, you know, they're better at this than we are, so we'd like them to do that bit for you, especially when it's a service close to what you do, and they probably think, oh, you guys could probably do it.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think of individual examples. I know we definitely have had that. I think one of a good example would probably be in and around sort of because product development and product development and product strategy ties in a lot to kind of like marketing strategy. So what is this product and who is it going to be for? And in our workshops, we'll often isolate demographics. So we'll kind of work out, we'll create personas for people. So we'll say, this application would be for somebody between the age of X and Y, of Y skills or Y income, or all of those types of things to try and pinpoint who, and then we'll give that person a name. So we've got an identity to kind of look back and say, would this application at various different stages, would this application serve Dave, for example, as our example persona? And if the answer is no, we've failed. So and customers then, when we've recommended, for example, somebody who's maybe a freelancer who's potentially good at launch marketing strategies for apps, or marketing agencies that have got real good skill, that for them is quite a bit confusing. Well, you did it at the start, and so why can't you do it later? And it's quite difficult to differentiate that out. But I think once they see what that other company, person, whatever offers and the experience that they have, it can usually be negated. It is just a difficult conversation initially because they probably have built a relationship, particularly with us, because we're right at the front end a lot of the time. Yeah. They've built a relationship with us as kind of, well, you're almost like our product ambassador now. You know everything about it. You've almost, you've spent 6 weeks working on this. You're in bed with it. You know it inside out. Why can't you do X or Y? Or and so it does become difficult, and people, usually, which is always a nice thing, they don't want to let us go and move on to to work with other companies where they haven't had any experience with. But then it's again that kind of trust circle. If we trust that company, that person to do that job, hopefully that can be passed on when in an introduction as well.
Yeah, we found that when you're in those initial meetings before you're a client, before they've come on board, laying out exactly what bit of the whole process you're going to do for them. Like, this is our bread and butter and where we're the best. We're the best at that bit. But to be honest, you'll need this bit at the end, this bit at the start, that bit over there. And we know people that do that are way better than us, but we won't be doing it. I think the earlier you can set that out to people, you're right, it kind of helps them get the picture of what's going on in the world.
Yeah, and I think if there's an ongoing, I guess there always would be, but in a client's mind, if there's an ongoing relationship where you can kind of point to another client or another case study or another, well, we've done this with, and this was the type of thing that we did with that, that's always quite good, I think, to be able to point out something that's happened previously between companies. But yeah, I think actually you make a really good point now, actually mapping it out at the start, going through that with them and saying this is exactly what we'll do, and then this is where you'll need. And again, from us as we're not entirely productized, but we do have productized offerings. That's quite easy because it's kind of like, well, this is where we'll start, and it's mapped out in weekly sprints. So this is what we'll start. This is what we'll achieve over that period of time, and then at this date, give or take, based on there being a lot of delays, which really from our perspective there shouldn't be. Then what we will then do is this. And that usually is introductions to, or at that point the client might be awaiting funding for a specific reason, both internally or they're going out for funding. So it might be that they're pitching it to internal stakeholders to get funding to move forward. But there's kind of like a start and end point in a lot of the processes we do, and then we can say, right, well, at that point, this is where you're going to need X, Y, Z.
Yeah, good. So it's really great when we talk, and I think we've sung a lot of praises about collaboration, that people in the tech industry especially kind of get that. And I think 10 years ago there was a bit more resistance, and over the last 10 years everyone's worked out it's better. But I've got one question. Since we've said loads of nice things about collab, does it ever become a sticking point for you when someone else is the specialist in that, and then you disagree over something in a project and you need them to do their bit and you're doing your bit? Can it become a big problem, or do you think most people are good enough to get past those issues when you disagree on something?
Yeah, I think I mean, it doesn't really matter if it's kind of collaboration or an internal team. You know, I've got quite a lot of friends who, for example, will work at big companies where they'll have potentially internal design and dev, and you know, the design team will spec something which isn't easily done in development, or you know, there's an element that the design team tackled it one way, but then when it comes to the actual execution, the development team say, well, we think it should be done in a different way, or we've got some legacy system which means it has to be implemented in this way, and that can happen with internally, or externally with, you know, collaboration. And for me, I think the solution to it is ongoing communication, but when it's internal, that feels like it should be easier than it is with collaboration, because internally, you know, you might all be running the same Slack channels or Slack tool, Teams, you know, whatever. You might have stand-ups that involve design and dev internally, whereas, you know, two collaboration teams, that potentially isn't going to be happening. So it's trying to find a happy medium, I think, between when you've got two teams that are collaborating, how do you, and it takes some planning, but how can you have somebody or someone that stitches that process together, so that when the designs are being done, they're being fed into development early before the client's kind of got access to them, to make sure that technically what we're proposing can be done, or when there's a tech spec done before the designs are even done, you know, making sure that that's clear. These are the limitations of the software we're working with. Don't go and design, I don't know, you know, something that's completely way out of scope or out of technical capabilities for this project. At least it's making sure that, I guess a lot of stuff can be, you know, the stuff we're seeing in the world right now could be solved with a little bit better communication, but everything can be solved through communication. But yes, to answer your question, there are sticking blocks which can occur and have occurred, and I think it can be exacerbated when it's with like two teams collaborating, because there's almost a little bit of start stop as opposed to one whole, you know, process. And I think as two companies working together, it's on us to get together and to find out a way of bridging that gap, so that it can be delivered seamlessly for the client without that kind of design stop, hand over to development team, no communication, you know, development complete, oh, but the designer proposed that, well, we weren't told that, well, it can't do that, you know, that sort of conversation.
Yeah, and the last thing anybody wants is for the client to be sat in the middle of that conversation being like, you guys are the experts, it out, like, why am I in the middle of this?
Yeah, and I mean, I think from a we have had that, in all honesty, we have had that where there's been that kind of gap between the two, and so the learnings from that is that if there is a way of, you know, it does sometimes mean that both parties or three parties, however many teams are collaborating, there is a little bit of what I would call it unpaid work, in that, you know, no one's being charged for that meeting that's taking place, that's going to pull everyone together to make sure everything works and is aligned before the client gets hold of it, or making sure that the tech spec's understood, or making all of that sort of stuff. But I guess ultimately it's well worth it for the greater good of project success, for ongoing collaboration, and for the customer.
Yeah, great. Absolutely agree, mate. Oh, it's been fantastic talking to you today, James. Thanks for taking some time out. I think it's really interesting how you took a book and made it how your business works, and then realised you were going to tweak stuff. What was the book called again? Sorry, just for our listeners.
Yeah, it's called Sprint. It's by a guy. Well, the guy who's kind of authored it is called James Knapp. So it's Jake, Knapp. And there's a couple of co-authors on there. I forget the last one, which is terrible, but John Zeratsky is the other guy who's written it, just because I used to listen to their podcast, so that's why I remember both of those. But yeah, really good process. I think, just in summary, for anyone, if you get a chance to read it, absolutely do. It talks about the ability to kind of understand problems, collaboratively work on solutions, prototype and test something in as little as 5 days. I think most people will reach the same conclusion as me, is that realistically there needs to be more. So we built a process around it, you know, including user research, including iteration, all of that sort of stuff. But as a core concept, it's a great way of kicking projects off and getting started. Great.
Well, there you go, listeners. If you're interested in getting design going, read that book, or just give James a ring. I'm sure he'll talk you through it.
Yeah, sounds good.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for listening, or if you're watching on YouTube, to the second episode of the Digital Dissect Podcast. Next time we've got Rob Sambach from Indie Spring, who's going to be talking about the sustainability of flexible working. But until next time, we'll see you again. Thanks, James.
Cheers, Dave.